Jesus called his 12 disciples to him and gave them authority to drive out evil spirits and to heal every disease and sickness.
The Bible contains remarkable stories of miracles and divine interventions. Moses parted the sea. Peter healed a man lame from his mother's womb. Jesus drove demons out of people and raised others from the dead. But are these types of events still happening today?
We too have a beam of divine light and guidance that God has put within the heart of every man. And it's one of the greatest proofs that there is a God.
More amazing supernatural things are happening than we realize.
This is Divine Intervention, the interview show that features intriguing people who've experienced the hand of God in amazing ways. Divine Intervention was created and produced with the purpose of encouraging believers, spiritual seekers, and skeptics alike that Jesus is alive and is still performing miracles and working in the world today.
I believe in miracles.
Here's your host, Daniel Fazzina.
Hello, friend, and welcome to Divine Intervention Radio. Yes, I am your host, Daniel Fazzina. So excited to be with you today. Got a very interesting guest who's going to be joining me to talk about some pretty cool things, and we're going to be doing a little bit of a departure from what we usually do. We're going to have him share his testimony, but this is actually going to be a bit of a teaching episode. We have an author who's going to be sharing what it was like in the days of Noah before the flood that destroyed the earth. It's going to be a very interesting show, a lot of great information to get to, so much to cover, and we will definitely get to that in a minute. But before we do that, I want to remind you that if you miss any of the shows of Divine Intervention, you can always find them in the archives at divineinterventionradio.com, divineinterventionradio.com. You can also connect with me on Facebook, facebook.com/Divine Intervention Radio. And you can connect with me on Twitter. You can follow me at Daniel Fazzina1. That's Daniel Fazzina, the numeral 1, on twitter.com. Write to me. I'd love to know what your thoughts are on the show. If the show has impacted you in any way, if it has blessed you, if it has encouraged you, if it has pointed you to Jesus, that's what we really want to do on the show. So let me know what the show means to you. If you haven't ever taken the time to write in, I would really appreciate it. DivineIntervention@mail.com is the email address, DivineIntervention@mail.com. And if you haven't checked out my book yet, I would highly encourage you to do that. I would love for you to read it and let me know your thoughts. The book is called Divine Intervention, 50 True Stories of God's Miracles Today. You've got people in there who have experienced God's miracles in all different types of ways, from answered prayers to healings, dramatic conversion experiences, provision, near-death experiences, you name it. All different ways in which the Lord has intervened in people's lives. So if you want some spiritual encouragement, do check out the book. You can find it at divineinterventionradio.com. Again, the name is Divine Intervention, 50 True Stories of God's Miracles Today. If you have read the book, please write to me and let me know what you think. I would love to have your feedback and your thoughts and comments. Again, my email address is divineintervention@mail.com. And if you'd be so kind, go to Amazon.com and write a 5-star review. I would love that. I read all the reviews, and I would appreciate that in helping to get the word out. So go to divineinterventionradio.com, pick up your copy of Divine Intervention, 50 True Stories of God's Miracles Today. And of course, I would be so grateful for a 5-star review on Amazon.com. All right, friend. Today's show is going to be very interesting. I'm going to have the author of a very intriguing book on the show. We're going to be speaking with Minister Dante Fortson, and his book is called As the Days of Noah Were, The Sons of God and the Coming Apocalypse. Now, friends, I have to tell you, this book is a thick book. It's, how many pages is it? It's about 400 pages, and I'm a slow reader, and I went through this book in a matter of days. It is incredible. One of the most comprehensive books I have ever read in terms of the big picture of God's plan, the Bible, and how everything just kind of makes sense. There were a lot of questions I had about the Old Testament in particular, and when you hear what Minister Fortson has to say about it, he paints a picture that really makes sense to me, but it's something you probably won't hear taught in churches. At least I never did. But it's really fascinating. It talks about, the sons of God. Who were the sons of God? They're mentioned in Genesis In chapter 6, it talks about the sons of God basically came to earth and saw the women of earth, that they were attractive. They went in unto them, and they bore children to them, and the same became mighty men, giants, or in some translations, Nephilim. They were mighty men, men of renown, men of old. It's a very curious verse in Genesis. It's got some pretty staggering implications, and we're going to be talking about that and how it ties into the big picture of the gospel and, God's plan throughout history. But it sheds some interesting light on history. And when you look at it from this perspective, if the sons of God or fallen angels were cohabitating with and breeding with human women, producing hybrids, that puts a very interesting spin on our history, and it's something that maybe a lot of people have overlooked or dismissed as, myth and legend, but God's Word says it happened. And then there's also a lot of extra biblical books and sources that confirm what the Bible teaches about this subject. And when you put it in perspective, it sheds a whole new light on Genesis and the Old Testament and God's plan for redemption and what is actually going on and what will happen in the end of days. So to put it more concisely, let me just read the description on the back of Minister Fortson's book. Again, the book is called As the Days of Noah Were, the Sons of God and the Coming Apocalypse. It says on the back here, what does the Bible really say about the last days on earth? Who were the sons of God? What is the truth behind the birth of giants in the book of Genesis? Did God really hide everything we need to know about the last days in the stories of Noah and Lot? Who or what is really behind all of the UFO sightings and the abduction of humans all over the world? These are just a few of the questions that this book seeks to answer. During our journey, we will explore stories from Babylon, Greece, Ireland, Ethiopia, and various other cultures to fill in the missing pieces to one of the biggest mysteries on our planet. Without further ado, I'd like to welcome Minister Dante Fortson right now on Divine Intervention Radio. Dante, welcome to Divine Intervention Radio. Thank you so much for taking the time out to share with us today.
Oh, thank you for having me on.
Not a problem. Very excited to have you on after I read your incredible book, As the Days of Noah Were. This is a very thick book, but I got through it very quickly because it was just so interesting and so comprehensive. We definitely want to get to that, but before we do, why don't you take us to the beginning a little bit? Tell us about your background. Who is Minister Dante Fortson, and how did you grow up, and how did you come to know Jesus?
Well, actually, I was raised in church. I spent most of the time in my grandfather's house with him and my grandmother, and there was a lot of experiences that happened in that house. And as I got older, I had no idea, the history behind the house, but a lot of supernatural stuff was going on in the house. Much of it wasn't talked about within the family, but everybody knew kind of what was going on. My mom had her experiences with her toys moving at night, stuff like that.
Oh, wow.
I had the same kind of experiences, and, as I got older, I shared it. But I guess my belief started when I was really young. I was about 5 years old, and one morning I woke up and I heard somebody calling my name in the house. And I told my grandmother, and she kept telling me it was the bad man calling. And I never knew what that meant, but that was her way of saying, I don't know if it was her way of saying the devil. I assumed it was, but the more I find out about that house, it could have meant something else. But she kept telling me it was the bad man calling, don't answer. And so I actually did answer it, and the voice told me to get baptized. So that day I asked my grandfather about being baptized, and it happened that the church was, having a baptism that night. And I found that to be kind of interesting, as I got older and, reflect back on it. But, at the time, the pastor, he thought I was too young, so he asked me a bunch of questions about Jesus and the Bible and salvation. And I answered all the questions to his satisfaction. So he went ahead and let me get baptized. And so that's really where my journey really began with the supernatural and finding Christ and really getting into the Bible.
Now, how old were you at that point?
I was about 5 years old.
5 years old, and you got baptized. Wow, that's pretty cool to make a decision that young. Many people don't come to that realization until much later in life, so interesting. So,
well, I will again say that it was the voice that told me to get baptized.
Right.
That's what I was listening to.
That's interesting. So, looking back, you think maybe it was the voice of the Lord?
Yeah, I think it may have been the voice of the Lord. Could have been him sending an angel. I'm not 100% sure because, I was 5. I'm really just recollecting on an experience I had years and years ago.
Right.
So it's kind of hard to say what it was because I didn't, take in all the information or I wasn't attuned to the biblical principles and, having that kind of foundation back then.
I understand. No, that's very interesting, though. So, and the history of your house, did you subsequently find out some more about it? I mean, were you living in a haunted house, or were there poltergeists, or what was going on?
Well, what was going on, it's kind of hard to put your finger on. My mom had the experience with her toys moving. She had a bird, handcrafted bird that somebody had made for her, and it sat on this little perch. And she said at night the perch would swing and the bird would chirp. And I thought that was kind of crazy when I got older because I had a Knight Rider toy, and inside was Michael Knight, and you had Kit the car.
Right.
Car talked, of course. That was what it was supposed to do. But the little action figure that came with it would shift the gears. And I remember playing with it. It would shift. I would roll it, and that's what it was. And so one night when my mom came over, I tried to show her because I thought that's how the toy functioned, and it wouldn't do it. And she told me, she said, the toy isn't supposed to move. And I was like, no, it moves, look. And it wouldn't do it. So that was, just a couple of experiences with that. My mother told me that when her uncle died when she was younger, she said she heard him walking on the roof and went outside, and he told her that he had died. Now, her uncle didn't live in the house. Her uncle lived somewhere else in another state. And so when my grandfather came home and gave my grandmother the news, my mom had already known that he was dead.
Wow.
So, we had that. There were, you could feel stuff standing over you at night, hear footsteps walking around the house, like all kind of stuff.
Very interesting. My family has had its share of those things as well. My mom had received messages when neighbors were about to pass away and other family members, and she knew about it before they happened, which was kind of freaky for her. And then that's happened throughout her life, but she's also received messages of warning, like God speaking to her, like, to protect her and her family from certain situations. We've also had instances in our house, when I was very, very young, where toys and things would just spontaneously jump off the shelf, or fall off the shelf, or fly off the shelves for no apparent reason, and all sorts of things like that. So I can definitely relate to kind of where you're coming from, and I guess correct me if I'm wrong, but is that how you kind of got interested in the supernatural and getting into the study of that realm, I guess you could say?
Yeah, that's really where it started. And, it kind of progressed from there with that little bit of interest. Later on, a few years after I was baptized, I actually found out that it wasn't really my aunt, but we called her Aunt Ree, and she lived with us. She lived with my grandfather, and because I was over there, I would always be around her, but she was into voodoo.
Oh, wow.
And I didn't really know, what voodoo was, but, at the time, it was something I had just seen on TV. I didn't even know it was real. But, yeah, she was into voodoo. My grandfather was a very high-level Mason, and as he got toward the end of his life, he kind of got out of it.
Oh, that's good.
It was just, they had Masonic meetings and, all kind of stuff going on in the house. And so these experiences made me really get into reading ghost stories when I was younger. And so I'd read those stories. They would scare me, but I'd read them anyway. I would sneak and get the books. My mom told me not to read them. And so the ghost, that turned into an interest in vampires and werewolves and all kinds of stuff until I got to close to high school. Between that 8th and 9th grade year, I started taking up an interest in UFOs and aliens and all kind of different stuff. And so that's kind of how my journey has been since I was a little kid.
You and I have kind of similar journeys and similar interests. I used to read a lot of UFO stories and cryptozoology stories and ghost stories as a kid. Always fascinated with that. And as I grew in my faith, I kind of wondered how to reconcile the two. Were they real? Was it demonic? Are there real entities? And where does that fit into the Bible? And that's one of the reasons why I wanted to talk to you, because your book, As the Days of Noah Were, it's so comprehensive and it covers so much. And you do a really great job of tying the big picture together and where all these things come from and how it actually has roots in reality. These are not just fictional things that people made up. These are experiences that people have, And when you look at the big picture of what was really going on in the days of Noah and Lot and what is, I believe, still happening, it actually puts things in perspective. So why don't we get into a little bit about your book, As the Days of Noah Were. What do you think would be a good place to start? Maybe Genesis 6, or what do you think?
Yeah, we can start there.
Okay. There's a very curious passage in Genesis 6. Why don't you talk about that and then kind of lay the groundwork for it a little bit, if you would.
All right. So in Genesis 6, you have basically the flood, the instructions to build the ark, how to build it, and then it ends with the flood coming. And so the traditional interpretation is that the world was so bad and people were so wicked that God wanted to wipe out the earth, and he only wanted to save Noah and his family, and pretty much that was it, and Noah was saved because he was righteous. That's the traditional interpretation. However, when you start to do a lot of digging into what's being taught in the churches, it doesn't add up. You learn that there are actually two different biblical doctrines being taught in church. You have the Tanaic doctrine, which is basically word-of-mouth doctrine, and then you have the scripture, where you refer to the Bible. And so those are the two different prevailing doctrines. And so in most churches, people tend to mix those because people don't actually go back and question the pastor in most churches. Some churches they do, some individuals do. And therein lies the problem. When you chase the traditional interpretation down, around between Genesis 6, chapter 6, verses 2 through 4, it says, the sons of God came in unto the daughters of men. And so the traditional interpretation is that the sons of God were the righteous Sethites and that the daughters of men were the unrighteous line of Cain. However, when you read the text, it mentions nothing of Cain and Seth. In fact, in the Hebrew, it calls them the sons of Elohim, and then it refers to the daughters of Adam. It does not mention Cain or Seth anywhere in the text. It specifically mentions Elohim, which is translated as God in the Bible, and Adam, or Adam, A-D-A-M. So those are the two mentioned. And the further back you go from there, you find out that the Sethite theory gained popularity around 3rd century A.D. Julius Sextus Africanus started to promote that theory, and then from there the Catholic Church actually declared it heresy, and the penalty for heresy was death. So you kind of have the original interpretation die down.
Okay.
Well, the original or the oldest interpretation is that the sons of God were angels, and that the daughters of Adam or the daughters of men were human women,
right,
from the line of Adam, just women in general, and that there was a cohabitation between angels and humans that wasn't supposed to happen. And so further down it says the giants were born because of this. Now, the problem here is when Cain and Seth's line mix, they're just humans, so why would giants be born from that? Right. However, when you have the unnatural or the supernatural breeding with the natural, something unnatural occurs, and you have the giants, which in the Hebrew are called the Nephilim, or the fallen ones. In the Greek, it's translated as gigantes, or the earthborn, and that's where we get our word giants, from the word gigos in Greek. So it goes from Nephilim to gigantes to giants in English. And if you do any kind of research on the gigantes, you can actually just Google this or use Wikipedia, you'll see that the gigantes were Greek giants that had supernatural origin. And same thing with the Hebrew. The Nephilim were Hebrew giants that had supernatural origin. So everything keeps pointing back to this supernatural event that occurred in Genesis 6.
Now, this is amazing because, to someone who's not versed in this kind of stuff, you think about probably the most famous were the Greek Titans, or, you got like Hercules and these beings that were the son of Zeus and then of human women, and they were half god, basically. And I guess that's probably where we get the legends of these things from, because they were actually real. According to the Bible, this actually happened. Like, the fallen angels bred with women and produced these supermen. And I guess the word gigantes does not mean necessarily large or big that we think of, but they just happen to be large or big. But it actually means earthborn? Is that what you're saying?
Yes. Very gigantes.
Wow, that's fascinating stuff. And it just, when you take into account that this might have actually happened, and then you go from there, it changes your worldview on how you interpret history. And when you look at history going forward. I mean, I had a lot of questions, and one of the things I wanted to talk to you about was, in dealing with non-believers, atheists, and skeptics, a lot of times they have a big problem with the God of the Old Testament, and they say he was a murderous, jealous, genocidal God because he commands Gideon and Saul and others to go in and wipe out entire races and tribes of people, and they say that's genocide. And why would he do that? Like the Amalekites and others. And, in your explanation in the book, As the Days of Noah, it's because their gene pool was tainted. They were coming from a Nephilim gene pool. Like, do you want to kind of explain that phenomenon, if you will?
Well, yeah. Where do you want me to start from? From Genesis or the wiping out of the tribes that you mentioned?
Yeah, wiping out of the tribes, I guess, because, it's not just that he just didn't like certain tribes, right? I mean, there was a real reason to do this.
Yeah, there was. Basically, what happens is in the Genesis verses, chapter 6, verses 2 through 4, it mentions there were giants on the earth in those days and also after that. And then it talks about the sons of God coming in unto the daughters of women. So the flood wipes out all of the giants, and God preserves the gene pool of man, which I'm pretty sure we'll come back to Noah and we'll talk about the gene thing.
Absolutely.
But after the flood, this occurs again, and you find this in every culture after the flood, that more of these beings from the sky, we call them angels, other cultures call them gods, people have called them aliens, all kinds of different references.
Watchers. From
the sky. They come down, they start impregnating human women again, and then you have these tribes pop up. What many people don't catch is in Genesis 14, you have the recurrence of the Nephilim. They are split into tribes called the Rephaim, the Emim, the Zamzumim, and several other tribes. And these are the tribes that go to war on Sodom and Gomorrah's side against the other kings. Mm-hmm. And so you have this huge battle going on. You see these names, and you don't really know what they link to. But there's something else going on there, too, because Lot gets kidnapped. And when Abraham goes after Lot, Abraham has a league with the Amorites. I believe it was 2 or 3 brothers. I can't remember the exact. I think it was 2 brothers. Abraham has a league with the Amorites. And so it's the Amorites who help Abraham rescue Lot. But it's not until later on in the book of, I want to say, Amos. I might be wrong on this. I have to go check the reference because I'm doing this off the top of my head.
That's all right.
Anyway, you find out that the Amorites were tall as cedars, and God destroys them. That reference to being as tall as cedars comes up a lot in reference to the hybrids. And later on, you find out that the Amorites were indeed hybrids. So Abraham had a league with that group, and they helped him rescue Lot. And so there was a lot of activity going on. And then when you get to the Sodom and Gomorrah incident, people make Sodom and Gomorrah about homosexuality. And I always disagree because in Ezekiel 16, you'll find a list. And the Bible specifically gives 6 reasons why Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed. If anybody wants to check those 6 reasons, they're found in Ezekiel 16. Now, when people make it about homosexuality and say this is why God destroyed it, what they tend to forget is that in Genesis 18, when God first goes to Abraham, and he eats with Abraham, and Abraham begs him to spare the cities, Abraham actually talked him down to 10 people.
Right.
Now, if this was all about God was going to destroy it because of homosexuality, there would have been no way for Abraham to talk him down into sparing. It was 5 cities total. Talk him into sparing it for just 10 people. There was something else going on. Now, if you recall the order of events, once the angels get into Sodom, the men come after the angels. There's something about the angels that these men want. And it's not that they just want to rape any man. They specifically want these 2 angels, even to the point where Lot offers his daughters, and they turn it down. They turn the daughters down. Now, it's not until that point that the city is definitely going to be destroyed because they're trying to get to these angels. And one of my theories is, and again, this is just a theory, is that because of what had gone on, the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, Zoar, and the other 2, they had already had league with the hybrids during this war, the 5 kings. And because they had league, they already knew what was going down between angels and humans. And I believe that these people knew that these men were supernatural.
Wow.
And the more you start to look into what was going on, it seems to be that every time this supernatural union takes place between humans and angels, God wipes out stuff, which is going back to what you were saying about the tribes being wiped out.
Yes.
And so all throughout the Old Testament, we see that there are giants appearing. David fights Goliath. David picks up 5 stones. And again, what many people don't know is that Goliath had 4 brothers, and you find that in the books of 1 Samuel and 1 and 2 Samuel, and you'll find in 1 and 2 Chronicles where they kill Goliath's 4 brothers. And you see those tribes being wiped out. God says, wipe out every man, woman, child, and animal, and don't take anything from it.
Oh,
Just
man.
wipe it out. And so all throughout the Old Testament, I believe that in order to avoid getting back to what happened in Noah's day, where God had to wipe out the world because it was so bad, God did what was selective genocide to preserve the human gene.
Right.
And
yeah, that's interesting.
we see over and over again in the Old Testament where they go down into the Valley of Giants in Joshua and Moses' day, and they wipe out every giant tribe, and they just keep trying to keep the numbers down. I believe that's why we see that in the Old Testament.
Very fascinating stuff. Going back to the war in I guess it was Genesis 12 or Genesis 14, I always wondered how Abraham. It said he had a certain number of trained servants, but it wasn't that many. It was like less than 100, I think, or something like that. And how did he go about wiping out several different armies with that few number of men? And I never understood that. And I think, well, I guess God helped him. And if he had the help of supernatural beings like giants, half angel, half men, who were champions, then it can be a lot more plausible. As implausible as it sounds, that's the most logical explanation, I think. But anyway, let's get back to your book right after the break. We're speaking with Minister Dante Fortson. He's our special guest today on Divine Intervention Radio. I'm Daniel Fazina, and we will be right back.
We'll be right back with more from Daniel Fazina and Divine Intervention right after this.
I believe in miracles.
Hey, this is Daniel Fazina of Divine Intervention Radio. The Bible contains some incredible stories of miracles and divine interventions. Jesus calmed a raging storm, healed paralytics, and even raised the dead. But are these types of events still happening today? The answer to this question, as you will see from reading my book, Divine Intervention, 50 True Stories of God's Miracles Today, is an emphatic yes. Contained within the book is a collection of amazing true stories that attest to this fact. You will read the astonishing first-hand accounts of people who have been healed of paralysis, terminal cancer, and tumors through prayer. You will see the love of God powerfully transform the life of an Islamic terrorist. You will witness the liberation of the demon-possessed, the resurrection of the dead, and much more. Prepare to be awed and inspired as you experience divine intervention. More information about Divine Intervention, 50 True Stories of God's Miracles Today can be found at www.divineinterventionradio.com or by calling 800-247-4784. That's 1-800-247-4784. Times are tough, not getting easier, but there's an opportunity that could make a significant change in your financial situation. People are paying too much for home utilities, and everybody has them. Help friends and family save money and get paid for it. No obligation. You don't even have to talk to anyone unless you want to. Just listen to a 3-minute recorded message. Call now, 203-717-3124. 203-717-3124. Listen, decide, and you could be on your way to a better tomorrow. 203-717-3124. Divine Intervention welcomes the support of Latirzo Associates, Certified Public Accountants. Latirzo Associates, Certified Public Accountants is a family-owned and operated Christian business serving their clients with quality accounting services for over 40 years, offering full-service accounting for any type of business, large or small, in any state of the union. Latirzo Associates, Certified Public Accountants, 12 Oak Street, No. 5, West Hampton Beach, New York, 11978. Phone 631-288-3334. That's 631-288-3334.
Hey, I'm L.A. Marzulli, author, lecturer, filmmaker, and you're listening to Divine Intervention with Daniel Fazina.
Is this a real guy? Is he just fantasy? Cause of his grand size, no one's safe from fatality. Open your eyes, look up at Goliath and see.
Welcome back to Divine Intervention Radio. I'm your host, Daniel Fazina, and you're listening to the interview show that features intriguing people who've experienced the hand of God in amazing ways. Today's special guest is Minister Dante Fortson. He is the author of As the Days of Noah Were, The Sons of God, and the Coming Apocalypse. Dante, welcome back.
Oh, thank you.
No problem. So we covered a lot before the break, but I want to get back to Noah and this satanic plot to corrupt the gene pool and really destroy any means of the Savior coming in, and that is Jesus Christ, to redeem mankind, because there was a plot to do that all throughout history, and one that you probably won't hear taught in churches is that he was trying to corrupt the gene pool by injecting foreign DNA, you could say. It's angelic, fallen angel DNA. There's an interesting scripture that you kind of alluded to earlier about Noah being thought to be saved because he was righteous. But if you look at the King James Version of the Bible, it says Noah was perfect in his generations. And there's a very significant meaning to that many people miss. Can you kind of go into that for us?
Yeah, it says Noah was perfect in his generations, and it also mentions Noah was just. And it calls Noah righteous as well. It calls Noah righteous and just and perfect in his generations. That is a key phrase right there. But let's talk about righteous and just. Okay. They look like they mean the same thing in the English language. However, the words used in the Hebrew are two different words there. Noah is basically called tamim in Genesis. And what tamim means means without spot or blemish, and it's something used to refer to the sacrificial lamb. And because this is used to refer to the sacrificial lamb, it refers to genetics. The lamb had to be spotless, physically spotless. And that's what's interesting about the use of the word. Now, hold on, I'm trying to scroll real quick on chapter 6. All right, here we go. Noah was a just man and perfect in his generations. All right, so that word just is a reference to his moral character. The word perfect, again, is tamim, which is a reference to his genetic appearance. And there's a reason they said he was perfect in his generations, and that is because the corruption that was going on with all of the angels taking human women. And so this genetic purity became important, and I believe that the reason for the tampering in the first place was so that Satan could stop the seed of the woman. In Genesis 3:15, God declares war on Satan and says basically that Satan will die at the hands of the seed of the woman, which signifies a virgin birth. Now, how do you stop the seed of the woman? First, we see the whole situation with Cain killing Abel. That right there, and God talks about sin crouching at the door. And Cain kills Abel. So now you have one son disqualified because he's a murderer and the other son is dead. And so Satan doesn't have to worry about that. But then Seth comes along. And so the lineage of Seth begins to populate. And you also have Cain's lineage, which is still around. And the Bible says Adam and Eve had other sons and daughters. Right. So Satan has no clue where this seed of the woman is coming from. So what do? You tamper with the DNA by mixing angel and human. And so therefore you no longer have a human if you can tamper with all the genetics on Earth.
Wow.
You can avoid that situation. But God, seeing Noah, said he was genetically pure. And he was also just. So he had moral character and he was physically a good specimen or pure specimen. And so God saves Noah and his family and his sons, and then the three sons repopulate the entire earth after the flood. So what we start to see is small pockets around the area where God's chosen are. Abraham ends up in the land near Sodom and Gomorrah. And what do we see there? We see a war full of giants. And we know that Abraham and Lot both come from the same lineage. So Lot is kidnapped, and Sodom and Gomorrah, they begin to lose this fight until Abraham jumps in the fight. Well, you have Abraham save Lot, and as you follow the genetics, you start to see weird things happen. Lot ends up, getting his two daughters pregnant after the whole Sodom and Gomorrah incident. Now, when Lot gets his daughters pregnant, we usually write that off as, just some weird occurrence. But Moab was one of the sons born to Lot through his daughter.
Right.
Now, Moab or where the Moabites come from. And if we read the book of Ruth, we find out that she's a Moabitess. And she ends up getting with Boaz, and then Boaz has Obed, and then Obed has Jesse, and Jesse has David. So God uses that union between Lot and his daughter, which Satan probably wasn't even looking at. He was like, okay, they're disqualified. He had, a kid with his daughter. God's not going to use them. Satan is probably thinking this. And throughout the Old Testament, we see that there is a command for the Hebrews not to mix with the Moabites. They're commanded not to mix. And so the Hebrews from Abraham's lineage stay separate until we get down to the Ruth story. And then all of a sudden they come together again, and then that's where the line of David comes from. So I believe that there's a genetic back and forth between Satan and God, as Satan continuously tries to corrupt the line, and God is continuously in a state of preserving the line through outside-of-the-box ways.
Wow. This is something that'll really bake your noodle if you really think about it. But it's very fascinating because when you put it in perspective, it finally, at least for me, it finally makes sense. Why would God command, going into a certain area, wiping out entire tribes of people, man, woman, child, and even beast? Because, what you also point out in your wonderful book, As the Days of Noah Were, not only were angels interbreeding with humans, they were somehow doing genetic experimentations on animals and corrupting those as well. And if you look at Genesis, it talks about the entire earth, all flesh had become corrupted. And, I used to look at that and say, well, that just means that people were evil and, morally corrupt. But it can mean more than that, can it?
Yeah, if you actually look in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, it gives you a list of all the different kinds of flesh. It says all flesh is not the same flesh. There's one kind of flesh for birds, fish, animals, and humans, and it says then there are celestial bodies and terrestrial bodies. Terrestrial meaning earth, celestial meaning heavenly. So Paul gives a breakdown that there are different types of flesh. And when we look at the Noah scenario, it says all flesh had become corrupted. We have all the terrestrial types of flesh, the fish, the birds, the man, and beast there, but we also have the celestial flesh there via the angels. So I believe that Genesis is telling us that there was a lot more going on. It said all flesh.
Yeah. And
just some, but all flesh had corrupted its way. And so I think that's a very significant part that we often skip over.
Right. And when you take this into account, the Genesis story of what was happening, and then you tie it with a lot of extra biblical sources like, I guess, the book of Maccabees, Jubilees, and also the book of Enoch, which goes into great detail about what, the angels were supposedly doing as far as genetic manipulation. And then you look at history or legends such as the Greeks and other supposedly mythological creatures. I mean, you've got satyrs, which are supposedly half man, half goat. You've got centaurs, half man, half horse. You got mermaid, half man, half fish. I mean, is it possible that these mythological creatures were actually real at some point?
I believe that they were real, and this is the reason I believe that they are real. We talk so much about mythology, and we call it mythology and say it's not real. But if we look at what the Bible says, if somebody's a Bible-believing Christian and they read Ecclesiastes, it says there's nothing new under the sun. The thing that has been is the thing that will be, and so on and so forth. It says that over and over and over again. And if we look at our modern times, we either have to say this is 100% new, which is not what the Bible says. It says the thing that has been is the thing that will be, and there's nothing new under the sun. We see in China they were mixing rabbits and humans. We see human blood being mixed with pigs. We see human organs being grown in sheep. We see attempts at mixing human and ape DNA for very long periods of history. And I mean, over and over and over again. In England, I believe in 2012 or 2011, in the UK, they were talking about mixing cow and human DNA. And so they're already working on this. The Animal-Human Hybridization Act of 2009 by Sam D. Brownback, it made it a felony to be in possession, a felony to create an animal-human hybrid and a misdemeanor to be in possession of an animal-human hybrid. The Catholic Church has even gone as far as to actually defend animal-human hybrids' rights, saying that if they're created in a lab, we should not destroy them because they're considered life. And the scientists are saying we don't want them to live past 18 weeks. And so they want to kill the hybrids. The Catholic Church wants to let the hybrids survive. And so we're looking at a very real situation to where everything that we read about that's mythological could become a reality very soon, depending on how the politics play out. And so in that regard, it would go back to exactly like it was in the days of Noah, where people were tampering with stuff. And like you said, we find stories of mermaids and centaurs and minotaurs and all that sort of thing. I believe it happened before, and it will happen again.
And we see that we see those type of creatures depicted in ancient art, from Babylon to Greece to Rome, and also in their histories as well. And then, can you speak to the very interesting message that Jesus gives about how it will be in the last days? He specifically references the days of Noah and the days of Lot. And, why do you think that he chose those two time periods to warn us about what would be happening at the end of the age?
Well, the days of Lot, again, we get to the part where the humans were trying to rape the angels in the days of Lot. There's specifically a sexual reference there. And again, people make it about homosexuality, but there was something deeper going on. They wanted these angels for sexual purposes. In the days of Noah, the angels wanted the humans for sexual purposes. Jesus says in Matthew 24:37, "But as the days of Noah were, so shall the coming of the Son of Man be." Now, this is where it gets interesting. In verse 26, right before that, Jesus says, "But of that day and hour knoweth no man, no, not the angels in heaven, but my Father only." So Jesus mentions men and he mentions angels. And the reason I point this out is because as we read through, again, I'll say verse 37 again, "But as the days of Noah were, so shall the coming of the Son of Man be. For as in the days that were before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage until the day that Noah entered into the ark." Now, one of the things we learn in school is how to find the subject of basically a sentence, a book, a paragraph. How do you find the subject? Well, you go backwards and you look and see who was mentioned. Well, the closest mention we have is in verse 36. It says man, and then it says angels. And even if we don't want to apply that to the verse and we want to say, okay, well, let's go back and look at the days of Noah and see what was going on, again, we find the reference to men or human women, and we find angels. Angels taking women as wives. It says they took wives of all which they chose. So we have this reference to being like the days of Noah. It says in those days they were eating, drinking, marrying, giving in marriage. You go back to the days of Noah, ask the question, who was eating, drinking, marrying, and giving in marriage? It was the angels and the human women. So Jesus' reference to me is very specific. And then you have Daniel 2:43 that says, "They shall mingle themselves with the seed of men, but they shall not cleave to them." Now, this is interesting because the last kingdom on earth is iron mixed with clay. Now, clay, miry clay, throughout the Bible, the Old Testament, is used to refer to humans. I am the potter, you are the clay. So that reference is used to refer to humans. So you have iron mixed with clay. And you have they are mingling with the seed of men. The only logical conclusion that you can get out of that is the seed of men are human offspring.
Right.
That's the seed of men. So what are they that are mingling with the seed of men? They have to be something other than human. And people have come up with all kind of different things. Oh, these are clones, but clones are still human. Usually when I hear that, it usually tells me that the person saying it doesn't know how cloning actually works. Clones are still human.
Right.
And then you have, if you look at modern day reports, you have that situation going on with the alien abduction reports.
Now,
People are saying, okay, aliens took me, got me pregnant, and then they removed the fetus. And the biblical reference in Daniel 2:43 where it says they shall not cleave to one another, that cleave is a reference to marriage. In the Old Testament, they were marrying. Daniel says this time it'll be different. They'll mix with the seed of men, but they won't marry them. They won't cleave to them.
That is interesting.
So we see what's going on with this so-called alien phenomenon, and I don't believe they're extraterrestrials. Satan is a liar and a deceiver, and I believe that what is going on is we're seeing, again, a recurrence of the events happening just like it did in the days of Noah.
Very fascinating stuff. Friend, you're listening to Divine Intervention Radio, and we are speaking with Minister Dante Fortson. His book is called As the Days of Noah Were, The Sons of God and the Coming Apocalypse. And I have to tell you, this is one of the most fascinating books I have ever read. And I've read a lot of books. This is really an incredible book that does a great job of tying together what I call the big picture and helping, at least it helped me understand, the big plan of God and how the sons of God were interacting with the the children of men, and we're having what is basically an incursion of fallen angels. We had it in the days of Noah, we had it in the days of Lot, and what we're having now, I believe, and I think Minister Fortson believes, that it is tied in with the UFO phenomenon. So, Minister Fortson, you're saying that these reports of UFOs are actually real and they're happening, but they may not be extraterrestrials. I mean, can you go into what kind of evidence you have of that, or what research you've done on that front?
All right. Well, let's start with the Old Testament verse that everybody's familiar with, the ascension of Elijah, when the chariots of fire come down and they pick up Elijah and they take him back up in the whirlwind. That right there, the word, we think of chariots in the sense of a wooden cart with wheels on it. And it's kind of unfortunate, but basically the word used there is rakeb. And then the other word that's generally used is Merkabah in Hebrew. And both of them basically mean vehicle. It's a general word that means vehicle. And if you're in 1611 translating the Bible into English, your vehicle in 1611, we had chariots. There were no cars or airplanes or any other type of vehicles around. It's basically, chariots and carts and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what you would reference. You would assume that's what they're referring to, because that's the technology that had existed all the way up until that point. So when they're in 1611, they translate the word vehicle as chariot. And so that's kind of stuck in people's conscience when they read that as this thing was wooden and it had wheels. But no, we see a flaming chariot come out the sky, scoop up Elijah. He goes up in a whirlwind, and he's taken off to heaven. And we see this multiple times in the Bible where angels come in chariots or vehicles, which is what the Hebrew word says. In different mythologies from around the world, again, we find these general words for vehicle, and they're always depicted as chariot. But Ra has one. Ahura Mazda, like all these beings from the sky have these flying vehicles that they travel in. And I always found that interesting. Once I started to really get into the UFO thing, I was like, this is kind of interesting that all these people report the same type of occurrence all throughout history. So what that leads me to believe is that, again, angels have technology. And whatever this technology is, they have flying craft. This right here, to me, is interesting because of what happens in the book of Daniel. In the book of Daniel, Daniel starts to fast for 21 days. Gabriel comes to Daniel after 21 days. Gabriel says, I was sent to you from the first day you started fasting, but I was withheld by the prince of Persia, and then I had to call Michael, one of the chief princes, and then after that, the prince of Greece comes, and I have to fight with him. Now, when we look at that, how did the prince of Persia intercept Gabriel? That means Gabriel had to come from somewhere to somewhere, and in between that flight, he got interrupted somehow. It doesn't tell us the means that he used. We don't know if he was flying physically or in some kind of craft. What we do know is that in the Bible, only two different groups of angels are described as having wings. The women in Zechariah 5, they have wings, and the four cherubim or seraphim that are around God's throne have wings. No other angels are mentioned as having wings in the Bible. Even though we usually depict angels as wings, it's just not biblical. So Gabriel had to travel a distance, and in between that distance, somehow another supernatural entity more powerful than him was able to intercept his flight to Daniel.
Wow.
And then he had to call for help. How did he call Michael for help? That in itself is interesting. And then Michael had to get to him to free him up, to hold this guy off. Whoever they're fighting, the Prince of Persia, Michael has to fight with him while Gabriel gets the message through, and then Gabriel has to go back and help finish the fight. So there's a lot going on here, and that leads me to believe that angels, there's a lot more to angelic society than we give it credit for.
Interesting. Wow. Fascinating stuff. Again, you're listening to Divine Intervention Radio. We are visiting with our special guest, Minister Dante Fortson. And there's so much that we can go into here as far as, you actually make a list of some of the things that angels can do in your book, As the Days of Noah Were, and you give scriptural references, and one of them is they can use technology, they can lie, they can have sex. And this is something that we never really think about. Jesus says that we're going to be like the angels in heaven who are no longer given in marriage, and they don't take wives or husbands, but he never says they can't have sex. And when you look at Genesis, it talks about the seed of the serpent and the seed of woman. Well, I always thought the seed of serpent, well, what does that mean? Does that mean spiritual seed, or can, angels actually have progeny?
Well, it's interesting that you asked that, because a lot of people, they think that way. And the word for seed there is the same word used in both instances. So law of interpretation says if you apply a literal meaning to one, you have to apply the literal meaning to the other in the same prophecy. If you say one is spiritual, then you have to say the other is spiritual. Now, if we look at the seed of the woman, it's a reference to the virgin birth, a real live virgin birth, the Son of God. And when we look at the reference to the seed of the serpent, it's a reference to a future seed. And I always point out that Satan's ambition was to be like God. I will be like the Most High. Well, God has a son who is part divine, part human, and we call him Christ. Mm-hmm. And he had this with a woman, a virgin. So I believe that for two reasons, that Satan in the future, the Antichrist, which is kind of a misnomer, but we'll go with it since people are familiar with that terminology, I believe that the Antichrist will be born of a virgin.
Okay.
And I believe that is what will get the Jews to jump on board. I believe that's what will get the Muslims to jump on board with the Mahdi belief. I believe that will get the rest of the world to jump on board, because it happens in a time period where we have documentation, YouTube footage, and everything else. But I believe that the Antichrist will be born of a virgin, and he will be the son of Satan. And part of the reason for this belief is if we look at if we look at 2 Peter. 2 Peter says that the angels were bound in chains of darkness, these angels before the flood. It specifically references the flood. And it says the angels were bound in chains of darkness. Jude says that the sin of the angels was the same as the sin of Sodom and Gomorrah, going after strange flesh. Now, again, all flesh is not the same flesh. So to go after a strange flesh, it means a different kind of flesh. And in the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, we see him going after the angels. So back to Satan, these angels were bound that went after the human women in Genesis. And if we look at the end of Revelation, Satan is also bound for 1,000 years before he is sent to the lake of fire. So I believe that he has to serve out his sentence for having a human child, which he's not supposed to do, and then he serves out his sentence for the rest of it in the lake of fire.
Wow. That is deep. Oh, my gosh. I mean, we could go on all day with all this stuff, but friend, we are just scratching the surface here, but I highly recommend you get a copy of Minister Fortson's book. Check it out. It is out there, but it just makes so much sense. It's called As the Days of Noah Were by Minister Dante Fortson. We're going to put a link to it on our website, divineinterventionradio.com, and you can also find out more information at ministerfortson.com. Dante, I want to thank you so much for sharing. I wish we could do this all day, but alas, we are out of time. But thank you again, sir. I really appreciate your work and taking the time out to share with us.
Thank you for having me on. I appreciate it.
Not a problem. Friend, that about does it for this episode of Divine Intervention Radio. I hope it has encouraged you and informed you as well. God willing, we'll see you again next week for another exciting episode of Divine Intervention Radio. Take care and God bless.
You've been listening to Divine Intervention with your host, Daniel Fazina. You can email Daniel at divineintervention@mail.com. That's divineintervention@mail.com. All programs of Divine Intervention are available online at divineinterventionradio.com. That's divineinterventionradio.com. Join us next time here on Divine Intervention.